Into session 3. Well, unfortunately, all we need to do is go outside to understand the importance of this next session titled Fire in the Watershed.
It was pretty significant.
Record.
Okay.
Well, hello everyone. I can see all the participants starting to join the session, so we're just going to give it a minute or two for people to join in, and then we'll get started. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for taking time to listen today on our webinar about fire in the watershed. So I'm really grateful that all of you could join. I'm also really grateful to the folks at BizWest who hosted the Confluence conference from which this rebroadcast is coming from. It was a coincidence, a timely coincidence that a few of us were asked to participate in that Confluence conference. That invitation happened before the Cameron Peak fire happened. And after we did that panel, we realized how timely that information was for everyone who is interested in or affected by the Cameron Peak fire. And so BizWest very graciously allowed us to rebroadcast this panel so that we could share that information with another set of audience and a wider set of folks who might be interested. So we really appreciate that. Today you're going to hear, as I said, it's a rebroadcast. There'll be about an hour panel presentation that includes panelists including me, Jared Heath from City of Fort Collins Utilities, Chuck Rhoades, Dr. Chuck Rhoades from Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Dr. Stephanie Kampf from Colorado State University. A panel that's going to go over the various water quality and post-fire impacts from an event like Cameron Peak Fire and how that affects our water supply. This is the first webinar in a series that we're hoping to put forward to help explain and communicate about the effects of Cameron Peak Fire and what recovery is going to look like for our communities and our watershed. So stay tuned to our newsletter and our Facebook to hear more about other opportunities to learn about recovery and things that we can get done in the watershed. And with that, I'm gonna share the screen and get the video going. That, like I said, is gonna run for about an hour, and then we'll shift from the recording and we'll have the panelists available for about half an hour to answer questions. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully technology will bear with me and work. So here we go. And you'll hear for the first minute a little bit, the introduction is actually going to be from someone from BizWest, and then it will shift to the panelists.
Session 3. Well, unfortunately, all we need to do is go outside to understand the importance of this next session titled Fire in the Watershed. These fires have wreaked havoc on our natural resources, but they also can produce lingering effects on watersheds as ash and debris loot water supplies. How can these effects be mitigated, and what should municipalities and water suppliers be doing to address the problem? And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jen Kovecses, who's the Executive Director for the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. While living in California, Jen had the opportunity to work for local nonprofits, offering science and policy analysis to help protect water quality and habitat in California's beautiful coastal wetlands. After moving to Colorado in 2011, she began volunteering with Wetlands Restoration Volunteers as a way to get to know some of the amazing places in Colorado. This led to the opportunity to work with Wetlands Restoration Volunteers, managing its post-fire restoration programs. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Jen Kovecses.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. As mentioned, my name is Jen Kovecses. I'm the Executive Director with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. And we're here to talk today a little bit about the impacts of wildfires to our watersheds and all of our precious watershed values. Today we have an amazing panel. So I'm really excited to bring this panel to the group today. I think we'll have a great discussion about how these types of wildfires affect and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Stephanie Kampf. We'll talk a little bit about how these types of wildfires affect how our rivers function. And Dr. Chuck Rhoades, who will talk about impacts for our water quality. And then finally, Jared Heath with the City of Fort Collins will talk about how these types of wildfires affect our water supply systems. So just briefly and very broadly, it's a given in the West that wildfires are an important part of the ecosystems. Our ecosystems, especially our forested headwaters, have evolved over time to interact with wildfires, and they have shaped what our forests and our headwaters look like. And that relationship changes as you move up in elevation in our forests. So at lower and mid elevations where most our forests are dominated by ponderosa pines, that looks like a certain type of relationship with historically that would have been lower intensity, more frequent wildfires. And as you move up in elevation, we would see fewer wildfires that tended to be slightly higher in intensity in our lodgepole forests. And our forests have changed over time and adapted to interact and evolve with these wildfires. So really quickly, some of the highlights of some of those adaptations in our ponderosa forests, where we had typically, historically, would have seen less frequent wildfires that would have been lower intensity, more focused on the ground. Ponderosas over time adapted some features like thick bark that allowed them to survive exposure to these fires. And as a result, historically, we would have expected that these forests would have been open forests with fewer trees, and we would have had wildlife and other plants and ecosystems that adapt to this type of system. Similarly, as you go up in elevation, when you hit those lodgepole dominated forests, where we had much fewer frequency of these fires, or those types of fires have different types of adaptations and different types of fires as a result. Probably the most famous or well-known adaptation that lodgepole forests have to exposure to fire is what we know as, or what we call serotinous. So the cones, some of the cones of lodgepoles depend on exposure to heat to fire to, the heat of fire to open up and release their seeds and start the process of regeneration after exposure to a wildfire. So if wildfires do so much good for our forests and they're such an integral part of those ecosystems, why are they so bad? Why do we perceive them that way? So part of it is the result of a legacy of land management decisions that have been ongoing for over 100 years. It goes without saying that fires they're scary and risky for human communities and for timber values and other forest values. Where we put people, fires can be scary, and about 100 years ago, our land management agencies had an unofficial policy that all fires should be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. So the unintended consequence of this, this management approach really was that as we tried to extinguish all fires, we ended up allowing fuels to build up in our forests because we stopped that interaction of wildfires, the role that wildfires played in reducing fuels and keeping those forests more open. So by increasing the fuel loads in our forests over time, when we do have fires start, they tend to be these larger, high intensity fires. So the connection that we're going to make here today is, what does that mean, not just for the forests themselves, but what does that mean for how watersheds and forests play in moving water through our watersheds? So what you see here in the upper right-hand corner is a graphic that shows how water tends to move through forests when they're in their more natural state. And typically, we have most of our water actually infiltrates into the ground or evapotranspirates into the air. When we have these large intensity wildfires, it burns up that soil layer and changes how water moves through our forests and our watershed, and we get more water running overland. And Stephanie Kampf will talk a little bit more in detail about some of these, what that means for our watersheds and our rivers. But the outcome of that is some pretty significant changes in our watersheds. So after the fires are put out and the first responders go home and the media stops paying attention, from a watershed's perspective, that's when the problems really start. And we start seeing these really big changes in the post-fire environment and how water moves through our systems and how that impacts our different watershed values. And it goes without saying that as we've made these land management changes over time, we've started to see different trends in the types of wildfires that we have. So over the past 100 years, we've seen more frequent, higher intensity, bigger footprints of fires across the West, and that's true in Colorado as well. So what does that mean for our communities? So wherever we are, watersheds are doing work for us. They provide the clean water that supports so much of our everyday lives. And while we may not recognize it on our day-to-day basis, there's a huge community and economic impact to maintaining healthy watersheds. The headwaters of our western forests provide our raw drinking water supply. That in turn supports a lot of economic activity. So if you just think of Fort Collins and our beer industry, that's a double-digit multi-million-dollar industry that supports thousands of jobs. It also is a very integral part of the IT business in Colorado. So we have a strong chip manufacturing industry here in Fort Collins, and that industry depends on clean water and clean air as part of their production processes. And of course, we love playing in our forests, but because of that, there's a strong economic attachment to what that kind of clean rivers bring to our economy as well. We have a really vital recreation industry here in the Front Range. The Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest is the third or fourth most popular or most visited national forest in the country. The whitewater rafting industry on the Poudre is valued anywhere from $1 million to close to $3 million per season. The Poudre River itself supports hundreds of thousands of acres of irrigated land. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has estimated that recreational fishing in Larimer County can be valued upwards of around $3 million per year. So it's not just a birds and bees issue when we talk about wildfires and how they impact our forests and rivers. It really does have a strong community and economic and business tie-in as well. supply features are and where they interact with this, the Cameron Peak Fire itself. So we have, and Jared Heath will go into more details about this, but our water supply infrastructure is largely situated in these headwaters areas. And so now they're sitting inside the burn footprint of the Cameron Peak Fire. On your right, what you see is what's happening across the Front Range right now. And so this is just a screen grab that I pulled from the heat map imagery. And you can see the variety of wildfires that are ongoing right now across the Front Range. This big red blob in the middle is the troublesome fire that exploded last night and is now burning around Grand Lake and Granby Lake and into the west end of Rocky Mountain National Park. And according to media reports this morning, it has shut down the top of the Colorado Big Thompson system. So that's the other side of our water supply. So Jared Heath will go into a little bit more details about how these types of wildfires will impact our water supply system. Before I hand it off to Stephanie Kampf to dive into the details of how these types of events affect our river systems, I just wanted to touch a little bit on looking forward and how do we get ahead of some of these problems. For those of us who've been working in this space around trying to mitigate or prevent these types of wildfires and use forest restoration techniques to help bring our forest back into balance with wildfires, it's been a long trajectory of learning. And one of the things that people across, or practitioners and managers across the West have been learning is that we need to work at a larger scale, sort of at the same scale of size of restoration that these wildfires are. So there's been a lot of effort across partners and across jurisdictions to start planning implementation of restoration projects at that scale and working together to try and bring wildfire in a managed way back into those ecosystems. So what you see on the left is just a planning map that many of us have been working on in terms of trying to do some of these larger impact forest restoration efforts. And that's an effort that has been ongoing for a couple of years and is working from the Wyoming border through Boulder County to try and get these larger scale forest restoration activities on the ground. Unfortunately, the Cameron Peak Fire has done some of the work for us ahead of our plans. But we are still confident that this collaborative work across agencies and other partners working at larger footprint scales is going to be one of the tools that we can use across the West to help get ahead of some of these problems. And I'm happy to talk about that or answer any more questions when we get into the Q&A session. With that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Stephanie Kampf and let her dive into the science details behind what happens to our rivers in these scenarios.
I am queuing up the slide. All right. So in this massive wildfire season, it is quite shocking to see how much areas burn and a lot of damage results from that. And unfortunately, as Jen mentioned, it just begins with the fire. After that, we have a series of hazards to be concerned with that affect our watershed. So you've seen some maps already. I'm going to put those into the watershed context. And so at the top, you see the Poudre River watershed, the Poudre River running through the south part of that watershed here. And the 2012 High Park fire was a huge impact to our watershed. And you can see that what was a very large fire at the time has become dwarfed compared to the Cameron Peak fire, which just stayed, at this sort of smaller size for a while, but then really just has blown up over the past few weeks, affecting very much of our watershed as well as the Big Thompson watershed. And then this new Calwood fire is affecting the St. Vrain. And of course, as Jen mentioned, the overnight blow up of the East Troublesome fire affects the West Slope collection system. And so we're seeing real time our watersheds that supply the water for the Front Range being very much affected by wildfire. So the effect to the watershed starts on hill slopes where the ground has been burned and there's no longer protected vegetation. And then it moves, that water moves down slope, creates gully systems, and eventually reaches our rivers. So I'm just going to really quickly go over some of the things that are happening after wildfire to water. So again, it starts on the hill slope, and we begin with this condition where the hill slopes have lost their ground cover. Sometimes the soil has been modified in such a way that the water doesn't infiltrate in. And so instead of infiltrating into the ground and gradually moving down slope towards streams, we have this increase in overland flow. So water just going over the surface and taking sediment with it as it goes. And so that water starts concentrating into larger paths and bringing sediment along with it. So this is an example of how much sediment can erode after even a really small rainstorm after fire. And that erosion starts carving into the landscape, and it can create gully systems. Those tend to be pretty prominent on roads, but they can happen elsewhere. Another thing that can happen in addition to that overland flow that's eroding into gullies is that we can have slope failures because the vegetation is no longer there with the roots to hold the soil in place. If there's enough rain that gets into the system, then those slopes can fail suddenly. And so you get debris flows and landslides. So getting further down into stream networks, that water that's moving quickly over the land surface during rainstorms after a fire is getting to streams and rivers very rapidly. So that can create a flash flood hazard. And because it's carrying all that sediment, it's also creating these very turbid waters, which Jared will talk about the impact of that to water supply. What actually happens in the river depends on a balance between how much more water is coming in and how much more sediment is coming in. And so you'll see some places where the effect on the river will be that it incisors, so it starts cutting down into its bed and banks, or where it builds up, it aggrades. And so if the water, excess water input dominates, then this balance will tip over on the water side, and you start to see the arrows switch over to this degradation. And so you can see channels start to really cut in and take more area than they did before. Versus if the sediment side of the scale tips, there's more sediment coming in and that dominates over the water effect, then you might see a lot of sedimentation in channels. So where they fill up with this new sediment that's come from the fire. All right, so quite a few hazards to be concerned with after fire. What kinds of things can we do to mitigate those hazards? Really, one of the biggest tools is to start at the hill slope and try to slow down that water, get it to infiltrate instead of eroding and rapidly getting to streams. And so the most common tool for that is to apply mulch. What mulch does is it covers the ground surface, so helps the water slow down, and it's a quick fix. So one of the things that you can do most immediately after fire to try to slow down this process of change. Further downstream, there will be additional water and additional sediment. So doing things to control that extra water and sediment to the extent possible is helpful. Here's an example of a mulch application that worked really well. So if the mulch is nicely spread across the ground, then it can be pretty effective at slowing down erosion. But if the mulch gets hung up in the trees, if it's been dropped by helicopter and it blows around, then it's not as effective. Here's a graph after the High Park fire showing the difference between mulched and unmulched hill slopes the year after the fire in 2013. And so you can see that there does seem to be quite a difference in how much erosion happens after the fire. But where we really see these hazards start to slow down is when vegetation recovers. So that's pretty key after fires to get that vegetation to come back. And once there's enough vegetation covering the ground, that's going to allow more infiltration, slow down the overland flow and erosion problem. For downstream, it's important to have warning systems in place for these flash floods that can happen. And fortunately, front range communities are pretty well set up with these warning systems already and have responded quite well to fire and setting up new warning systems. But knowing that this is going to happen, that is one of the key mitigation efforts that needs to be taken, as well as ensuring that along roads, the culverts are quite large, that they can pass these larger flows and all the debris that they may be carrying. So after Hyde Park Fire, again, there are quite a few culvert improvements that have made the Poudre River watershed in an improved condition in terms of controlling drainage. So in summary, the key problem with wildfires from a watershed perspective is that they're reducing ground cover and setting off this series of processes where there's more overland flow, erosion, and debris flows. And that gets down into streams and manifests as flooding, more suspended sediments, and some big changes in channels. To mitigate that, we can try to add more ground cover, but ultimately what we really need is the vegetation to recover. Having warning systems in place and being prepared for that large amount of drainage that will come is well really important. The 2020 fires are quite unique, as you all know, because they're happening so late in the season. And so we're not going to have any ground cover reestablishing before snowmelt. Normally, we don't think of snowmelt as being the crisis time in terms of post-fire hydrologic response. We worry more about the summer rainstorms. But given that there's not a lot of ground cover and some of the areas that are burned are quite high elevation and get a lot of snowpack, we might see some more activity during snowmelt than we have seen in previous fires. And we will find out what happens. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chuck for talking about the long-term response.
Great, thank you very much. I assume I am now sharing my screen. Can any of my colleagues give me a thumbs
Yes,
up?
you are.
Okay, thanks very much. Great. Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be part of this group, and we're all kind of going through this crazy year, 2020, and it sort of seems to just keep on going. So appreciate Jen and Stephanie's comments on various scales. And one of the things that I'd sort of like to talk about in my talk is sort of thinking a little bit longer term. And one of the things to kind of, you know, Jen talked about some of the fire cycles. It's important to remember that a lot of these forests that are burning now, many of them are 100 years old, and quite a few of them are much, much older than that. Some of the fires that are burning in these high elevation forests, there haven't been fires in these areas for several hundred years. So 300 to 500 year old trees are burning, and it's a situation that is incredibly unique. If you look at the map that I'm showing, you can see recent fires in this sort of northern Colorado, North Park, Front Range area, whatever you want to call it. And you can really see that these areas are kind of closing together, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why, but many of those big fires are very recent. We keep breaking records on new wildfire sizes. So things are changing, and they have long-term consequences. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. If I can advance the slide. Okay, great. So Jared is going to talk about sort of the implications for water utilities and the downstream water quality. And Jen pointed that out. You know, 2/3 of the water that comes that is used by Western cities and Western communities comes from headwater forests. So the connection is very, very important. Other things that are also important to keep in mind are the connections with the aquatic ecosystems and how well those are behaving, and what the implications of wildfires might be when you have a large amount of nutrients and a large amount of light that comes in, and you have disturbances. What does that mean for those ecosystems? Jen pointed out some of the values of those for recreation, for fishing, and so on. They're also kind of important, and Stephanie alluded to this, you get erosion coming off. The erosion and the nutrients that are coming off of these forested areas, that's also the productivity of those forests. So there's a piece to that where you have nutrients that are being lost or carbon that's being lost from these systems and going downstream, and that leaves forests with fewer nutrients. They may be less productive. And so it's an important kind of benchmark for the restoration or the recovery of those systems. So Stephanie talked about some of the changes that happen when you remove vegetation, and if you sort of go back to the pre-fire image that she was sort of alluding to, our water supply and our nutrient use and so on are fairly well balanced. So our undisturbed watersheds don't export a lot of nutrients. You don't see much sediment coming out of them. There's a good sort of control between the uptake of nutrients, for example, and the supply. But when you sort of take the top off of that, you remove the trees or you remove the vegetation, you can see the kind of change in infiltration and erosion that Stephanie showed. What she doesn't show and you can't see is the lack of nutrient uptake. Those plants are no longer taking up nutrients. They're no longer able to kind of hold those on the site. And that translates into nitrogen and phosphorus moving into streams where it may influence things like eutrophication. And you've probably heard of algal blooms, and those are concerns both for aquatic health, but also for water treatment. You can imagine in the photo on the right what a pre-fire forest is. All of those trees are sucking up nutrients and maintaining sediment and nutrients in a site, as opposed to the picture below, which is what happened after a fire. One of the take-homes I'd like to leave you with today is all fires are not the same message. And it's important to think about this because we're seeing a lot of fires moving through, we're just seeing these blobs on maps. We don't know what those really look like. And it takes a while to go out and actually assess the responses from a water quality perspective. And it varies logically. Some fires you can see in the photo, some fires will burn an entire tributary, and that area will respond very, very dramatically because there's been a huge loss of vegetation and a huge loss of the organic layer protecting the soil surface. Other ones not so much, and it scales with the size of watersheds. And you can see from that photo, that's the Hayman fire. There's a large variety of options, and that's the same. And at this point, the U.S. Forest Service is out running around mapping how burn severity lays down on the landscape and trying to determine what that means for water utilities, for downstream water quality, and a lot of other things, the recovery of those areas. So fire severity is how people talk about that, and it's basically the amount of vegetation and organic layers that are taken off of the soil, and that is a direct that influences the water quality. So for example, in this graph, I'm showing various water quality constituents following the Hayman fire, and the red bars on the right are where you've had extensive amounts of severe wildfire within a catchment. Yellow is moderate and the green is unburned. So the extensive might mean that those areas, in this case, 50 to 60% of a catchment was burned. So a fairly extensive amount of burning. The important thing to see, those different panels show different times of the year. Those are fairly consistent in terms of that pattern. But one of the important things is this data was for 14 years after the fire. And that's another one of the take-home points I'd like to stress, is that some of these effects can last for quite a long time. Stephanie was talking about recovery of vegetation, and that helps to slow down the sediment. So the bottom line of that is sediment leaving the forest, and 15 years after the fire, 14, 15 years after the fire, that sediment signal is starting to to fall off. It's not such a big deal. We can still see that in some areas after certain rainstorms, but the nitrogen and the carbon that are coming off of these catchments are still elevated. And that indicates that there's actually been a change in the way those watersheds are processing nutrients. As I said before, prior to the fire, very little nutrients are making it out of the watershed. 90% or more are being held by the vegetation in a watershed. In this case, more than 50% of the nutrients that are coming in are now making it down into the aquatic ecosystems, are making it down to treatment plants. Carbon is making it into treatment plants where they can have effects on water quality and water treatment. So long-term effects are relevant. And this is sort of a scaling up story for a study that was done in 159 different watersheds around the Western US. A very similar response was shown to what we saw at Hayman. So 10 years on the far, on the figures on the right show 10 years after a fire for a number of these fairly large watersheds that burn, showing that areas that have more of the area burned, so in this case 25 to 50% of the watershed, those ones have a multiple fold increase in nitrogen and phosphorus compared to ones that were burned at lower severity. So these effects are both long lasting and widespread. Okay, so I mentioned sort of the bigger picture, and this is kind of the important part. Jen said, you know, fires are native, it's a part of our ecosystem, they've evolved with them and so on, but and we often learn in our sort of undergraduate ecology text that fire regenerates forests. So the cycle on the left-hand side shows a forest being burned and then recovering back to a forest again, and everything is sort of predictable and what we like to think about. But in recent years, people have been starting to report on fires that have kind of deviated. They're no longer behaving the way they were supposed to behave, and so the regeneration link is not working as planned. So even places where the pattern is fairly well understood, like at Yellowstone National Park, the fire frequency is either higher or the severity is higher and the regeneration is not coming back. And so there's some concern that these fires may be having longer term and sort of unintended consequences that we don't understand and that we may not like. And in Colorado, we have one of these that's going on right now. And I wanted to show this figure again. The map shows this year's fires, the non-grayed out or the non-hatched ones. And the picture on the upper left-hand corner is the bark beetle outbreak. And some of you who have, if you've been in Colorado for a decade or more, probably remember that there was a big bark beetle outbreak, and that happened starting in the late 90s. In fact, the troublesome fire, which is something that you heard about earlier, that was one of the initial nodes of the beetle outbreak and started back in the 90s, and the Forest Service was concerned about it at that point. And around Grand Lake and other places like the Williams Fork area, another place that burned this year, those areas were really taken apart by the beetle outbreak, and they've now been dead and standing dead for 15 years. So they're very dry fuels, and you can see the kind of overlap between the amount of that area that was killed by beetles and the amount that's now been burning. We've had over 500,000 acres of fires during this year. During the peak of the beetle outbreak, there was up to 1 million acres that were being affected by beetles in a given year. So that outbreak was pretty significant as well. It wasn't leaving burned watersheds, but it was killing things and it was changing the fuel profiles. And those things are related. And one of the important points to this is that we're starting to see in Colorado places where the regeneration does not follow the textbooks. So the figure on the left shows regeneration, new trees coming in after fires that happened in 2016 and 2018. And what you can see is a lot of zeros coming across from the left-hand side in various fires. It's not until you get over to the far right-hand side and you have a lot more cone serotiny, and that's one particular fire where we actually see really good regeneration. That fire, by the way, was the Badger Creek fire, which was affected by the Mullen fire. So I hope, but I don't know, some of that regeneration that we counted from the Badger Creek fire may have then been reburned by the Mullen fire, which is unfortunate. The other graph shows a similar response. This was following the Church Park fire, which was one of the initial sort of post-bark beetle fires that we've been studying. And for 4 years following the fire, we saw virtually no tree regeneration in areas where we certainly would have expected that for lodgepole and other conifers. So kind of some large sort of red flags or warning signs that make us think a little bit about the future. And so to bring this back to water, this is a picture of the Hayman fire scar that burned 18 years ago, and you can see what those landscapes look like now. They have yet to recover into forest, and that has definite implications for the water quality going downstream. So the data that you see shows the amount of greenness, which is basically an index for the amount of forest cover, and then the amount of stream nitrate, which is an important bioavailable form of nitrogen that influences aquatic biota and water treatment. The nitrate or the black graphs figures, and you can see in the high severity area, those symbols stay high across the entire record compared to the unburned area. And it is likely to take the revegetation back to a state where we have similar demand to the pre-fire conditions before we're actually going to close the loop on that nutrient picture. And so we have decades long effects of wildfires. And that's the last point I wanted to leave you with. And I think I have a thank you slide, and I don't know why this is not advancing very well. Yep, whoops, thanks very much. And I will cede the floor to the next contestant. Thank you very much.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. First off, I want to thank my colleagues and friends, Jen, Stephanie, and Chuck, for providing such a good context for my presentation. They got into some of the really important impacts and implications to water quality, as well as changes in land cover that really relate well to some of the impacts to our source water supply. My name is Jared Heath. I'm the watershed specialist with the City of Fort Collins Utilities, and I'm going to be discussing some of the impacts of wildfire on our source water supplies, our drinking water. And the City of Fort Collins Utilities is responsible for, at least our water utility is responsible for diversion and storage of our raw water supplies, drinking water treatment, and then distribution of our treated drinking water to our utilities customers, and then water quality monitoring and testing throughout all of those processes, as well as source water monitoring and protection. So I work for the Watershed program, which is under the Water Quality Services Division. And the Watershed program's mission is to monitor water quality for the protection of the city's drinking water supplies and the Poudre River. And we uphold this mission in 3 ways: through 1, collaborative water quality monitoring programs of our source water supplies, watershed management, and protection efforts. And then we also provide internal support for various watershed assessment and water quality studies. And today, this is just a general overview of my presentation. I'm going to provide an overview of the City of Fort Collins source watersheds, a little bit on wildfire history. We've got most of that already from the other presentations, but I'll go briefly into that. Impacts to our source water quality, and then managing those wildfire impacts from a utility perspective. So the City of Fort Collins receives its drinking water from 2 watersheds, the upper Poudre watershed and the combined Colorado and Big Thompson watersheds, which are otherwise known as the Colorado Big Thompson system. And these basins are both high elevation, ranging from 6,000 feet to 12,000 feet. The hydrology of both is snowmelt dominated, which means that a relatively large pulse of the water moves through the system in the late spring as the snow melts. the city pulls its drinking water supply off the Poudre right at the canyon mouth at Gateway Natural Area, just upstream of the North Fork, Cache the Poudre River. And then we also have shares within Colorado Big Thompson project of Horsetooth Reservoir water, which is a terminal reservoir within that system. Our water treatment facility lies just at the base of Soldier Canyon Dam, so we have a direct line in from Horsetooth, and we also have a 13-mile line from the Poudre River to our drinking water plant. Our service area is approximately 35 square miles. It's actually a little smaller than our actual city limits, and another drinking water provider serves the other portions of those of our population that are outside of our service area. In 2019, we treated 8.3 billion gallons of water and served just over 35,000 metered customers. 32,000 of those are residential customers, and about 3,000 of those are commercial customers. So one of the benefits of our watersheds is our watersheds are primarily forested. We do not have a lot of land use impacts in there, but with being primarily forested, one of the biggest risks to our watersheds are wildfires. And in 2012, we had extremely hot and dry conditions, which led to really extreme wildfire conditions throughout Colorado. And the upper Poudre watershed was impacted by two major wildfires in 2012. The first one was the Hewlett Gulch fire, which burned over 7,000 acres of basically a sub-watershed that drained both the main stem of the Poudre and into Seaman Reservoir, which is part of the North Fork. And then the High Park fire burned recently after that, and burned almost 90,000 acres of primarily forested landscape, which was characterized by that lower portion of the watershed, which is ponderosa and lodgepole pine, and then some mixed conifer species at the upper elevations. And now, we're in 2020 now, and we've had another severe drought year, and we're dealing with our most recent wildfire, which is the Cameron Peak fire. And as of today, it's burned over 206,000 acres since it's the largest wildfire in Colorado history. As Chuck mentioned, we just get these kind of blobs that show the perimeter of these fires, but within these blobs, there are kind of a mixed range of severity as well as unburned areas, which are later assessed to help guide us with mitigation and restoration after the fires are done. So, 2012 wildfires caused dramatic changes to the land cover, as Stephanie covered, within the upper Poudre watershed, which had an immediate impact and effect on watershed hydrology and water quality within and downstream of the burn scars. And the disturbance caused an increase in stream flow, sediment erosion into streams that were draining subbasins, specifically during those high intensity rainfall events. And then this loss of vegetation cover altered the cycling of water, carbon, nutrients, and other elements, which directly influenced water quality within the Poudre River. So this raw water quality table here is kind of some of those impacts that we see with respect to water quality within our raw waters. And then on the right side of the table are potentially some of those impacts that we see as we're trying to treat the water. So we see those increased nutrients can lead to algal blooms, and potentially the release of taste and odor compounds, specifically geosmin and 2-methyl isoborneol, as well as potential cyanobacteria releases. And then we also see those big changes in turbidity. Turbidity is a measure of the color of the water. Higher turbidities means there's increase in that color and suspended materials in the water. We can see increases in metals, which can lead to manganese in our drinking water supplies and our water turning pink. And then one of the big ones is increases in TOC, which can lead to the development of disinfection byproducts during the disinfection process, they're highly regulated, but they can cause some headaches if we see those rapid increases in changes, as well as some other changes in some more erosion-related water quality constituents. So So it's really important that we understand the changes to these impacts on our drinking water quality. And there's some ways that we can manage those. I'm going to go over these kind of four highlighted management strategies here, which is reduce redundancy in water supply, infrastructure operational improvements, and then surveillance of our water quality, as well as source water monitoring and protection. This is just a graphic of our drinking water, our water plant system. Again, we rely on Horsetooth Reservoir and the Poudre River as our drinking water sources. And these are really, it's been helpful for us having this dual source system to mitigate some of those effects that we see. After the first rainstorm, after the Hewlett Gulch fire, we saw significant changes to water quality within the Poudre River, and this event prompted the city to shut off its Poudre River supply and switch entirely over to Horsetooth Reservoir supply. We stayed offline for a while after that. We did at one point try to pull in some of the wildfire impacted water, but realized pretty quickly that it was going to be pretty difficult to treat that throughout this process here. So one of our biggest lines of defense during the High Park fire was to monitor Poudre River water quality very closely. And when we saw those debris flow and flood events, we would shut down our Poudre supply and rely 100% on our Horsetooth Reservoir supply. And the biggest threat to our utility is if both supplies were to be impaired at the same time. You know, another way to treat this impacted water is through our water treatment process. There's we measure water quality throughout that process and are able to make adjustments through the process to ensure that we're meeting safe drinking water standards, as well as continuing to provide high quality drinking water to our customers. And then lastly, after the High Park fire, we also built some additional infrastructure. We built another pre-sedimentation basin, which drops out some of those larger materials. So there's just a couple ways that we can address these impacts from more of an infrastructure related and operational related standpoint. Again, during the High Park fire, Stephanie went into some of this, and Chuck as well, but we saw some really big spikes in river turbidity that occurred when large amounts of ash and sediment were being delivered from the burned hill slopes into the watershed during those high intensity storm events. The highest pre-fire turbidity values that we saw in the Poudre River, which were during snowmelt runoff, were around 50 to 70 NTU, which is a measure of turbidity. And then during that first rain event following the fire, turbidity frequently exceeded 500, so an order of magnitude higher, and occasionally exceeded 1,000 NTU. So, and again, an attempt to treat a small amount of this fire impacted water in 2013 was deemed too high risk. And this led to strict shutdown threshold of 100 NTU on the Poudre River. So to manage for these unexpected and significant changes in turbidity, we deployed an early warning water quality response system, which is this, it's a multi-parameter water quality sonde that is equipped with a number of water quality sensors. So we have temperature and conductivity, pH, turbidity, and dissolved oxygen. And this system allows us adequate time for our operations to shut down our Poudre River pipeline and treat Horsetooth water. So these data are real time. They're coming into our water treatment facility SCADA system, as well as an online portal. And we've established various thresholds to provide early warning of those impacts coming in. And this has been one of our, this was and continues to be an important first line of defense in avoiding the impacts of wildfires on our water treatment facility operations. We also have a source water quality monitoring program. Our Upper Cache La Poudre collaborative water quality monitoring program is a collaborative effort between the City of Fort Collins, the City of Greeley, and Soldier Canyon Drinking Water Authority. We have a number of different sites throughout the Poudre that we can use to track water quality. And the goals of this program are to determine potential impacts on water treatment processes, assess seasonal and long-term trends in water quality, and help characterize our source watershed, investigate potential human environmental pressures, and then support watershed management and protection to maintain and improve watershed health. We also collaborate with Northern Water on monitoring Horsetooth Reservoir and water quality within Horsetooth Reservoir. We collect samples from these sites monthly from April through November for a variety of different water quality constituents. I would like to note too, we do have a number of sites on the North Fork, but for the purpose of this presentation, I've left those out. In 2018, we put out a water quality trends report. Every 5 years, we look at long-term trends from these sites. This table to the right here outlines some of those trends. If you see a positive or a plus sign, that is an increasing trend in concentration or levels. A negative is a decreasing trend. And then if you see these S's next to it, that's a step trend. So a step trend is an abrupt change in water quality. And what I wanted to highlight here is the importance of having that spatial network of water quality monitoring throughout our source watersheds provides us an understanding of potential changes either at specific sites or watershed scale changes. And you can see here, these sites highlighted in orange are sites that were impacted by the High Park fire. And there were a number of significant step changes that occurred. This next slide here provides detail of temporal changes. So from 2008 to 2018, the monitoring program began in 2008. And you can really see where those step changes occur after that High Park fire. And this, again, has really been important to help guide our water treatment efforts at our plant, as well as our watershed restoration efforts throughout our source drinking watershed. And then finally, one of the last other things that our program is responsible is source water protection. These list some of the goals here that are part of our program. Moving forward in some of the benefits that, some of the things that we've learned after the High Park fire is that collaboration is really important. Following that fire, we were part of forming the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, and that group has been super important for us moving forward after the fire, as well as our response efforts during the Cameron Peak fire. Currently, we're working on how we respond immediately to water quality impacts, as well as what are our post-fire restoration efforts going to be. So it's been great having a group like that can pull all of the various stakeholders together within the watershed so that we can target and identify areas for restoration and mitigation that protect our drinking water supplies, as well as the various infrastructure that we have within our source watersheds. And that's all I got. Thanks a lot.
All right, well, we are back. That's the end of our recorded presentation.
Awesome, thank you, Jared.
Oh.
I want to thank all of our panelists.
Not.
Thank you, Jen.
Sorry about that. Also, I apologize. I couldn't, if I muted myself to type answers to the questions in the Q&A box, people could hear me typing, couldn't hear the recording. And so if I unmuted, you could hear me typing. So I stopped answering things in the Q&A. Hopefully the sound was okay for the rest of, after I stopped doing that for everyone. So with that, I am gonna go open the floor for some questions. We have a few questions already in the Q&A box. If you can use the chat box though, that's a little bit easier for us to track and answer to. So if you can use the chat box to enter any questions, that would be great. And I will just ask a few of the questions that I saw in the Q&A box, and then we can see what else pops up in the chat box. So the first question that I see at the bottom is, Chuck, I know that there's been some revegetation efforts, i.e. trees on the Hayman fire footprint, which have fairly poor soils. Are any of these efforts successful?
The reforestation efforts on the Hayman have been fairly successful. I mean, they've planted a lot of ponderosa pine. They've been working for years there. I think there's some interest in sort of rethinking things a little bit to get trees planted out into the middle of some of the larger patches. A lot of the work has been done in sort of the low-hanging fruit areas along roads and so on. where work has been successful, but it hasn't really gotten way out into the middle of some of those big areas. And so planting in some of them might help facilitate expansion of forests sort of deeper into these big patches, because there are still very large patches that won't regenerate on their own for decades.
Great. There's another question in the Q&A box. The loss of tree canopy after wildfire must have a huge impact on the amount of water that reaches the ground during a rainstorm. However, I rarely see this issue mentioned in regard to high runoff after wildfire, and have never seen a study that attempted to quantify this effect. Is this an issue being addressed by research? That's probably one for Chuck or Stephanie.
I think Stephanie can hit that one out of the park.
So that's a good question, and it is important what happens to precipitation, both rain and snow, on its way to the ground. And so we usually see more of an impact on the snow side, because snow is more easily stored in tree canopies. It sticks together and it can stay up there. And so if the snow is sticking up in the tree canopy, then it's subject to more wind and radiation. It might sublimate, go back up into the atmosphere. Whereas if it goes straight to the ground, then you might actually get more snow reaching the ground. But it kind of ends up getting to be a complex story, because without the trees there, you also have more solar radiation or radiation from the sun that can melt the snow faster. So that's something that we'll be looking at in research after this fire, and people have looked at it. Not quite as much on the rain side as far as I'm aware. What has been looked at in more detail on the rain side would be the impact of those raindrops on bare ground, and how that impact of the raindrops can kind of dislodge some of the soil and promote more erosion. I hope that gets to the question.
Okay, so I do have a request from one of the attendees for him to ask the question out loud, because it's too long to type. So with that, I'm gonna let Matt Zaccali, I'm gonna unmute you, Matt, and you can go ahead and ask your question. Hopefully that worked.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, everyone knows I talk too much anyway. So I think I'm fairly clear on what we're talking about in the Cache La Poudre watershed and what we're trying to do there, what the potential impacts are, how we might remediate them. What's not as clear to me is water that's delivered through the CVT system into Horsetooth. And I guess maybe an example that's running through my mind is, if 2 or 3 years from now, Chuck, you're talking about this 15-year time frame with Hayman. If 2 or 3 years from now, there's some big flood event or storm event over on that side of the hill, and we get that water delivered into Horsetooth, what is that going to mean for our Horsetooth water? How can we mitigate that? I guess I have a lot of questions, but hopefully that makes some sense. What are we going to do about Horsetooth?
Well, let me start, and Stephanie maybe can jump in, and Jared probably has something to say about that, Matt. But I mean, one of the things, this is sort of traditional Lee McDonald type stuff. As soon as you start to get grass coming back up and you start to get re-veg, whatever it is, the concerns about erosion and sedimentation start to decrease. And so if you've got a moderate burn severity and you start to see grass coming up, the responses for hill slope erosion should start to drop off pretty fast. And that's kind of the story from our Hayman work. The sediment kind of tailed off faster than the nutrients, and I think that's kind of an important part, because there's grass and forbs, and there's sort of low statured vegetation out there. There just aren't trees that create all of that nutrient and biomass demand. So I think that if we have sites that revegetate at all, the sediment problem will probably disappear pretty quickly. And I think Lee talks about 50% cover, but Stephanie, you can probably correct me on that and probably add to this discussion.
Yes, so right within a few years, 3-ish years, if there's enough ground cover that has returned, then that sedimentation problem should reduce and the flooding problem. In terms of whether that sediment-laden water would come all the way over to Horsetooth, I think that's probably not likely because it will have passed through reservoirs before it gets there. So the issue is really more on that end and the extent to which the reservoirs get filled up with sediment, or you know, some of the intakes have to be shut down because of sediment issues.
Yeah, I can touch on that too, Matt. I think it's a good question. And I think this kind of relates to Tim has a question out there as well. But yeah, I think sediment might not be as big of an issue within that system. I think one of the things that, you know, a lot of us are concerned about is the impact of some of these reservoirs, high elevation reservoirs, which were also impacted in the troublesome fire. What we tend to see for a long time after fires is an increase in nutrients. So we're likely going to see nutrients loading into these reservoirs and probably some long-term impacts from those nutrients, potentially algal blooms, taste and odor issues. So it's hard to say how that would translate into Horsetooth Reservoir directly, but Northern Water has a pretty robust water quality monitoring program. So, you know, similar to what we have going on, we have some pre-fire data. We'll be able to track short-term and long-term trends and hopefully adapt to better manage those sources. And, you know, for Tim, your question, you know, we're just gonna, it's really a good point. Like I'd mentioned, our biggest concern is when both of those sources are impaired. So we're just gonna, you know, over the next few months, we're gonna be working closely with Northern Water to see if we can better understand those impacts and how those impacts could translate to how we operate at our water treatment plant by using both Horsetooth and the Poudre River supply. So it's kind of time will tell, but there's definitely there's some concern about having both of those supplies being impacted.
Great. Well, we have another question from Sue Schneider. Looks like a private property owner up in the burn area. What is the best mulch to use? Our property up the Poudre is a total burn and we're worried about flooding. And Stephanie, you could probably touch on that based on some of your research.
So what we saw during the High Park fire, after the High Park fire, was that there really wasn't a strong difference between the straw mulch or the wood shred mulch. I think some people think the wood shred mulch might be better because it would stay more easily on the ground. But we also saw straw mulch sites that worked exceptionally well, like really, really well. The issue with the straw mulch that we saw where it didn't work as well is when it was dropped from helicopters and didn't make it all the way to the ground, so it didn't spread over the ground as well. But in either case, both of those mulch types did a good job where they were evenly spread across the ground. Some of them did get moved by the September 2013 floods, if you remember that. But they both worked well. So that's my experience with it.
And Sue, I would just add that in our, more anecdotally than what Stephanie did with her research, but what we observed with putting straw mulch down on the ground, that there's a big impact of when you put it down. So like if you put it down in spring or late fall when the soil has more moisture in it, it tends to be less wind mobile than if you put it down in like the middle of summer. So that's just one thing to consider if you're going to think about using ag straw, which is less expensive. So there's a lot of appeal of using ag straw for mulching. The other thing to consider is that ag straw tends to come with it brings other friends along that you don't always want in your landscape. So that it's hard to control for weeds and other seeds that are in the agricultural straw. There are resources that will certify ag straw as weed-free, but that's only weed-free up to, I think, like 95% weed-free gets certified. So that's also just something for you to consider when you're thinking about the longer-term management of your landscape, that you want to think about some of those trade-offs. Wood mulch is much more expensive. And just as an aside, we are, along with the other watershed coalitions, trying to put together a series of webinars to help private landowners think through some of these issues. So you should see in the next couple of weeks announcements about the calendar for those over the winter. Okay, I'm going to shift. There's a few other questions coming through. Adding to the troublesome fire question, does anyone know what percentage of the watershed area of Lake Granby was burned or burn severity estimates, or for Grand Lake? I don't think the soil burn severity mapping has been completed for troublesome fire yet. So I don't think any of us can answer that just yet. The U.S. Forest Service is still working on that piece. But I don't know, I personally haven't looked at what percentage for East Troublesome burned of the Granby or Grand Lake watersheds, although it looked like a large percent of it just looking at the maps. I don't know, Chuck or Stephanie, if you guys have looked at that specifically.
We haven't looked at it. Bella, Allie probably has some of that information, but we haven't really started to dig into it yet. And I asked Eric Schroeder and Tom Matthews about that today, and we should see a report based on their funding request within the next few days. So we'll start to get that information and can share it.
Great. And then, so just, there was another question that I missed that was tied to the mulch question, which is, do pine needles make good mulch too? And I don't know that there's been studies on that specifically. Stephanie, do you know?
No, I don't know if there have been. I suppose if you got enough pine needles, I would think it would work. It would just have to be, a thick layer of them, right?
Yeah, I think the issue would be, how do you gather that many pine needles? But there isn't a source to purchase them. But if you happen for some reason to have a lot of pine needles lying around on your property, it might be just as effective if you can put it down in the same consistent way.
As an aside, where there are places where there are still needles in the trees, those areas are usually mapped as moderate, because the idea is that those needles will fall on the ground and provide some sort of cover and protection. So, it may be pretty sparse, but it's better than nothing. And so from a soil burn severity mapping perspective, the Forest Service mappers look for places where there are trees that still have needles and tend to call them less severe. They tend to be moderate.
All right, I've got one more question here in the chat box, and then I'll move over to see what's still sitting in the Q&A box. Is the bear assessment done for the Cameron Peak fire? And if so, is it available to the public? So Sue, the Forest Service did a bear report they were able to map the first 100,000 acres of burn severity for the Cameron Peak fire, and they released that report. We can post it on Facebook if you don't have that first report. It should be on the Forest Service's website, the INSEWeb, Cameron Peak INSEWeb, if you haven't seen that yet. They have so that first report only covered, issues for that first 100,000 acres that they were able to map initially. They literally just finished doing the mapping for the rest of the fire. So I don't know that the whole report has been amended yet. They just got the mapping done. So I don't know when the report itself will be updated and amended, but that first phase report should be on the INSEWeb page. So you should be able to find it there. If you can't find it there, just email me or Daniel and we'll make sure that it's accessible. And there you go. Daniel just put the link in the chat box. Okay, I'm gonna see what's lurking in the Q&A side of things. Okay, from Rob Addington with Nature Conservancy. I appreciated seeing the temporal trends in water quality constituents in one of Jared's slides. It looked like another spike in 2017 or so. Was this related to the High Park fire?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I had to pull up the slide again to kind of look what you're referring to, but it looks like it was another, potential spike in conductivity. And as you probably know, a lot of these water quality constituents are driven by changes in stream flow and hydrology for that season. So it might just be something to do with potentially what the snowpack was and what stream flow looked like that year. I did use a smoothing technique on scatter plot data for that as well. So it's really just to kind of give us a rough estimate of what those long-term trends look like. But I think it'd probably have to look a little bit deeper into some of the other hydrologic and meteorological data that we saw that year. Maybe flood event related as well with the increased erosion that we saw, and maybe elevated stream flow for that year that maybe drove that. But again, it was with some of the trend report that we did after the fire it was somewhat tough to pick out and point a finger at some of the impacts that we saw, because immediately after the wildfire we had a flood as well, which has impact, can have long-term impacts on water quality. So there's a number of things that are kind of playing into what we saw post-fire that are hard to tease out.
Well, Jared, that's a really good segue to another question that's still in the Q&A from Laura Lane, which is, did the 2012 High Park fire contribute to the 2013 flooding because of erosion? And maybe that's a bit for all of the panelists.
So is the question, was the flooding greater because of the fire having happened?
That's how I would interpret it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one of those questions that's hard to answer. When we look at impacts of disturbances, we tend to see the greatest impacts for small rain events, because a small rain on a fire landscape can produce a big response and almost no response on an unburned landscape. Whereas when you get to a really big storm, those differences become a lot smaller. So it may have made some difference, but it is difficult to tease apart from all the other things that were happening during that flood. There might have been some studies that attempted to look at the burn impact, but we had differences here in the burned area where we didn't have as much precipitation during that event as areas further south. So it made it difficult to figure if our burn contributed to extra flooding.
Laura, did that answer your question? You can put that in the chat box. If you still have another questions, just add it to the chat box. In the meantime, we have another question from Will Davis. Do we know what the general cost estimates per acre for different aspects of fire recovery are? Erosion control, seeding, re-veg, tree felling, etc. And do we have supply outfitters lists consolidated anywhere for landowners? So I'll sort of work backwards through part of that question. We are working on trying to come up, identify some local suppliers for things like mulch and wattles and that type of thing. And Daniel Bowker, our Forest and Fire project manager, has been working on a native seed mix and some local seed sources that we think do a good job for controlling weeds in their seed mixes. So we can distribute, we're trying to put that together to be able to distribute and have a source for landowners. So that should be available shortly. And then the general cost estimates can vary widely. Daniel, I don't know, do you want to answer that? You've been looking at some of that recently.
Yeah, Jen, sorry, I don't have a lot of that at my fingertips, but the mulching itself can be anywhere from $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 per acre, kind of depending on labor costs and that kind of thing. If you get into the wood straw, because the material itself is a little more expensive, also probably a little bit more effective. The company there says $6,000 to $7,000 per acre for that, getting it applied, and that includes the labor cost there. So fairly expensive when you start thinking of large areas of mulch. Best to put those in specific areas. Seed, I believe we were looking at somewhere around $18 a pound for one of those mountain specific seed mixes. But there's also a sterile triticale that is quite cheap. That will be a good thing to put down, and that's not going to reproduce. It's just going to germinate and hold the soil and then be replaced in the next couple of years by the seed bank that's already there. So that's an option to do. And yeah, well, we're putting that together and should have a lot of these sources available soon.
Okay, well, we have a few minutes left. I'm not seeing other questions coming up in the chat box right now or Q&A. So if anyone has any further questions, feel free to throw them into the chat box. in the
Hey, Jen.
yeah.
Bob Sturtevant had a question, and I don't think it got answered about tree regeneration. I kind of answered it on the
Oh.
side, but I thought that this would be something other folks might have something to pitch in on. He said that the Forest Service has been doing regen in the High Park fire, and he was wondering if anybody knows what the results of those. I don't really, and I know Stephanie does, but I think the little bit I've seen is that there's good regeneration in some of the lodgepole pine sites. I'm not sure down in the lower elevation, Bob, how good the ponderosa has been doing, but that I've just sort of, have kind of casual observations, and other people probably know specifically.
I don't know the Forest Service findings for that, but I've seen the same thing that Chuck mentioned, where there's good regeneration in the lodgepole, but not much coming back in the ponderosa.
Yeah, and I know that this isn't any of your research in particular, but I believe it was Camille Stevens who worked at CSU on a large study on regeneration in general across burnt landscapes, and found that those lower elevation ponderosa forests across wildfires were not seeing very good regeneration in those areas.
Yeah, that's probably Maren Chambers' work, and she's done a number of studies from Hayman all the way up, but both Camille and Maren and others are very interested in sort of what's going on in places where things have reburned, and there's sort of an additional disturbance on those lower elevation sites. So places where the Cameron Peak fire burned into High Park, that's of a special interest as well. And Bob, we're all very interested in that sort of high elevation regeneration in the beetle kill areas. The High Park fire happened pretty early on following the beetle outbreak. In other words, the trees were still either recently hit or just getting into the gray phase. So now that it's been quite a bit longer, we're curious to know how much seed viability and how the regen will do even in those lodgepole sites.
I just posted in the chat box a couple of years after the High Park fire, a bunch of us worked on a summary workshop and a paper that reviewed and provided an overview and summarized various research and monitoring outcomes from the High Park fire. It was published in the Rocky Mountain Research Station's Science You Can Use bulletin. And I just put the link to that in the chat box. It's a great resource to sort of get that big picture overview of a lot of the findings that came out, findings and remaining questions, I guess, that came out of the work that was done in the High Park fire, and is going to continue to inform some of the work that and research that will be happening with the Cameron Peak fire. Stephanie, I have a question for you, or not really a question, but maybe a request. I just noticed that CSU sent out that press release about the NSF proposal that you and your colleagues are working on, and some of us heard about it last week. But maybe you just want to give a quick snapshot for folks who are listening in right now on the research that you and your team will be working on, and what findings we might be able to hear from in the next couple of years from that research.
Right. So the grant is a rapid grant, so it's just a little bit of funding to get measurements quickly after the fire. And what we'll be looking at is the snowpack, stream flow, and sediment impacts. So the Cameron Peak fire spanned a really large elevation range. At the time that we wrote the proposal to get the grant, it was mostly at the higher elevations. And we are going to be looking at the impacts of the burn on how deep the snowpack gets. So going back to that question about, what's the role of trees in intercepting precipitation, we'll be looking at that and evaluating whether the snowpack increases or decreases because of the burn effect. And then we'll be measuring streams all the way from the high elevation down to the lower elevations to look at how they respond both to snowmelt and to the summer rains. And in those streams, we'll be measuring both the stream flow, but then also if the channels change. A lot of times after fire, the channels will get cut in because of excess flow, or they might get filled in with sediment that's eroded from hill slopes. So we'll be trying to track those changes as well. and quantifying how much sediment gets into some of the water supply reservoirs also.
Well, it looks like there are no more questions in the chat box. So I just wanted to again thank our panelists for being willing to come back on again and be here live to answer questions, and really say thank you again to BizWest for graciously allowing us to rebroadcast that presentation from that previous conference. I do want to let people know that CPRW is working on a couple, in addition to the webinars that you'll be able to hear about if you sign up at our e-newsletter or follow us on Facebook. We are also trying to kickstart doing some regular, roughly weekly Facebook Live mini updates on the recovery process, doing small, short interviews with different participants in the recovery team or different stakeholders who are affected by recovery, just to give quick updates to the community about what's happening in the recovery process. So if you follow us on Facebook, you'll see those. We're going to do one tomorrow at 2 o'clock with Shale Sabo from Larimer County Office of Emergency Management. And then lastly, I just wanted to make a pitch. CPRW is, of course, trying to raise money to help us manage and coordinate and do implementation for the post-fire recovery for Cameron Peak. We have a few really fun events coming up as we close out 2020. I put a link in the chat box for those upcoming events. If you want to do something fun to help raise some funds for recovery, we'd love to see you at those events. Or, you know, if you can't make those events, just sharing them on Facebook is also super helpful for spreading the word about the events. So with that, I'll just thank everyone again for participating and being here today with us. Like I said, we're going to do more of these, so stay tuned. And hopefully we'll see you on another webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jen.